Imagine walking through the bustling slave markets of 1837 Charleston, where human lives were bought and sold like cattle, and suddenly encountering someone so terrifying that even the most hardened slave traders refused to touch her. A woman whose very presence seemed to carry death itself. This is the story of Adira, the slave nobody dared to buy, and the dark secret that made grown men flee in terror. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the antebellum South and the forces that lurked in its shadows. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's step back into 1837 Charleston, where something wicked was about to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across Charleston's slave market as Isaiah Morton adjusted his worn leather satchel and tried to blend into the crowd of potential buyers. His heart hammered against his ribs. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and his cover as an undercover abolitionist would be blown. Just another day of documenting this hell, he thought, pulling his hat lower over his eyes. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the courtyard. Next up, we have a fine specimen. Strong back, good teeth, knows her way around a kitchen. Isaiah's stomach churned as he watched a young woman being dragged onto the wooden platform. But something was different about this one. The crowd, which had been pressing forward eagerly just moments before, began to step back. Murmurs rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped in still water. "That's her," whispered an elderly man beside Isaiah. "That's the one they can't sell." "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked, keeping his voice casual. The man's eyes darted nervously. "Name's Adira. Been on that block 7 times in the past month. Every buyer who's tried to take her..." He swallowed hard. "Well, let's just say they don't try twice." Isaiah studied the woman more closely. Adira stood tall despite her chains, her dark skin gleaming with perspiration under the harsh sun. Her eyes, God, her eyes, seemed to look right through the crowd as if she could see something the rest of them couldn't. The auctioneer's confident voice began to waver. "Do I hear $50? 40? She's perfectly healthy, I assure you." Silence. A well-dressed plantation owner who'd been examining slaves all morning took one look at Adira and backed away so quickly he nearly knocked over a woman behind him. "What's wrong with her?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Nothing," the auctioneer insisted, but sweat was now pouring down his face. She's had some bad luck with previous sales, that's all." Bad luck. Isaiah had heard the stories whispered in taverns and back alleys. Thomas Whitmore, a rice plantation owner, had purchased Adira 3 weeks ago. Found dead in his study the next morning. No marks on him, just gone. Heart stopped, the doctor said, though Whitmore was only 35 and healthy as a horse. Then there was Margaret Sinclair, who'd bought Adira for her household staff. Went mad within 2 days, started screaming about shadows following her, clawing at her own skin, until her husband had her committed to the asylum. Coincidences, Isaiah told himself. Has to be. But as he watched Adira on that platform, something cold crawled up his spine. The woman's lips were moving, barely perceptible, as if she were whispering something. And the temperature around the auction block seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. "No bids," the auctioneer's voice cracked. "Surely someone..." "I'll take her." The words left Isaiah's mouth before he could stop them. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, expressions ranging from shock to pity to outright horror. "What the hell am I doing?" But Adira's eyes had found his across the crowd, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw something flicker there. Not malice, not evil, but a desperate, pleading hope. The auctioneer looked like he might faint with relief. "Sold to the gentleman in the brown coat for $20. $20. For a healthy young woman who should have brought at least 100. As Isaiah approached the platform to complete the transaction, the crowd dispersed faster than he'd ever seen. People practically ran from the market square, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. The auctioneer thrust the papers at him with shaking hands. She's your responsibility now, sir. God help you." Isaiah climbed onto the platform where Adira waited, her wrists still bound in iron shackles. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd thought, maybe 20, 21 at most, but her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen far too much. "I'm Isaiah," he said quietly, as he fumbled with the key to her chains. "I'm going to help you." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unsettling dark eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was like honey poured over broken glass. "No, Mr. Morton," she said, and his blood turned to ice. He'd never told her his name. "I'm going to help you. Whether you survive it, well, that remains to be seen." The shackles fell to the wooden platform with a metallic clang that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. And somewhere in the distance, Isaiah could have sworn he heard something that sounded like laughter, cold, ancient, and utterly inhuman. Isaiah's hands trembled as he led Adira away from the auction block, acutely aware of every stare, every whispered prayer, every person who crossed themselves as they passed. The cobblestone streets of Charleston had never felt so hostile, so charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl. What have I gotten myself into? "Where are we going?" Adira asked, her voice carrying an odd music. Imagine walking through the bustling slave markets of 1837 Charleston, where human lives were bought and sold like cattle, and suddenly encountering someone so terrifying that even the most hardened slave traders refused to touch her. A woman whose very presence seemed to carry death itself. This is the story of Adira, the slave nobody dared to buy, and the dark secret that made grown men flee in terror. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the antebellum South and the forces that lurked in its shadows. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's step back into 1837 Charleston, where something wicked was about to unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across Charleston's slave market as Isaiah Morton adjusted his worn leather satchel and tried to blend into the crowd of potential buyers. His heart hammered against his ribs. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and his cover as an undercover abolitionist would be blown. Just another day of documenting this hell, he thought, pulling his hat lower over his eyes. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the courtyard. "Next up, we have a fine specimen. Strong back, good teeth, knows her way around a kitchen." Isaiah's stomach churned as he watched a young woman being dragged onto the wooden platform. But something was different about this one. The crowd, which had been pressing forward eagerly just moments before, began to step back. Murmurs rippled through the gathering like a stone dropped in still water. "That's her," whispered an elderly man beside Isaiah. "That's the one they can't sell." "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked, keeping his voice casual. The man's eyes darted nervously. "Name's Adira. Been on that block 7 times in the past month. Every buyer who's tried to take her..." He swallowed hard. "Well, let's just say they don't try twice." Isaiah studied the woman more closely. Adira stood tall despite her chains, her dark skin gleaming with perspiration under the harsh sun. Her eyes, God, her eyes, seemed to look right through the crowd as if she could see something the rest of them couldn't. The auctioneer's confident voice began to waver. "Do I hear $50? 40? She's perfectly healthy, I assure you." Silence. A well-dressed plantation owner who'd been examining slaves all morning took one look at Adira and backed away so quickly he nearly knocked over a woman behind him. "What's wrong with her?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Nothing," the auctioneer insisted, but sweat was now pouring down his face. She's had some bad luck with previous sales, that's all." "Bad luck." Isaiah had heard the stories whispered in taverns and back alleys. Thomas Whitmore, a rice plantation owner, had purchased Adira 3 weeks ago. Found dead in his study the next morning. No marks on him, just Gone. Heart stopped, the doctor said, though Whitmore was only 35 and healthy as a horse. Then there was Margaret Sinclair, who'd bought a deer for her household staff. Went mad within 2 days, started screaming about shadows following her, clawing at her own skin until her husband had her committed to the asylum. Coincidences, Isaiah told himself. Has to be. But as he watched Adira on that platform, something cold crawled up his spine. The woman's lips were moving, barely perceptible, as if she were whispering something. And the temperature around the auction block seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. No bids, the auctioneer's voice cracked. Surely someone... I'll take her. The words left Isaiah's mouth before he could stop them. Every head in the crowd turned toward him, expressions ranging from shock to pity to outright horror. What the hell am I doing? But Adira's eyes had found his across the crowd, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw something flicker there. Not malice, not evil, but a desperate, pleading hope. The auctioneer looked like he might faint with relief. Sold to the gentleman in the brown coat for $20. $20. For a healthy young woman who should have brought at least 100. As Isaiah approached the platform to complete the transaction, the crowd dispersed faster than he'd ever seen. People practically ran from the market square, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. The auctioneer thrust the papers at him with shaking hands. She's your responsibility now, sir. God help you. Isaiah climbed onto the platform where Adira waited, her wrists still bound in iron shackles. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd thought, maybe 20, 21 at most, but her eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen far too much. I'm Isaiah, he said quietly, as he fumbled with the key to her chains. I'm going to help you. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unsettling dark eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was like honey poured over broken glass. No, Mr. Morton, she said, and his blood turned to ice. He'd never told her his name. I'm going to help you. Whether you survive it, well, that remains to be seen. The shackles fell to the wooden platform with a metallic clang that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. And somewhere in the distance, Isaiah could have sworn he heard something that sounded like laughter, cold, ancient, and utterly inhuman. Isaiah's hands trembled as he led Adira away from the auction block, acutely aware of every stare, every whispered prayer, every person who crossed themselves as they passed. The cobblestone streets of Charleston had never felt so hostile, so charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl. What have I gotten myself into? Where are we going? Adira asked, her voice carrying an odd musical quality that seemed to resonate in his chest. My boarding house, Isaiah replied, then immediately questioned the wisdom of that decision. I have a room there, you'll be safe. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Safe? Oh, Mr. Morton, you truly don't understand what you've done, do you? They turned onto Meeting Street, and Isaiah noticed how the very air around them seemed to shimmer with heat, despite the October chill. Dogs whined and slunk away as they approached. Horses shied nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear. The stories about you, Isaiah said, trying to keep his voice steady. Are they true? Adira was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words sent ice through his veins. Every single one, and worse things you haven't heard yet. They reached Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, a 3-story brick building that had seen better days. Isaiah had been renting a small room on the 2nd floor for 2 months, using it as his base while he documented the horrors of the slave trade for the Northern Abolition Societies. Mrs. Pemberton emerged from the kitchen as they entered, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She was a widow in her 50s, kind enough but practical above all else. Her smile faltered the moment she saw Adira. Mr. Morton, she said slowly. What? Who is this? This is Adira, Isaiah said, surprised by how protective he suddenly felt. She'll be staying with me for a few days. Mrs. Pemberton's face went pale. She backed against the wall, her hand moving instinctively to the cross at her throat. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, not her. Anyone but her." "Mrs. Pemberton, what?" "I know who she is." The woman's voice rose to near hysteria. "My sister works for the Whitmores, worked before poor Thomas." She couldn't finish the sentence. Adira stepped forward, and Mrs. Pemberton actually whimpered. "I mean no harm to you or your house," Adira said gently. "I only need a place to rest." "Your voice," Mrs. Pemberton breathed. "It's just like they said, like music and poison mixed together." Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly had he bought at that auction? "Mrs. Pemberton, please," he began, but the landlady was already shaking her head frantically. "One night," she said. "One night, and then she goes. I won't have my house cursed. I won't end up like the others." They climbed the narrow stairs to Isaiah's room, Adira moving with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Every floorboard that creaked under Isaiah's weight remained silent beneath her feet. His room was small and spartanly furnished. A bed, a desk, a wash basin, and a trunk containing his few belongings. Adira moved to the window and gazed out at the harbor, where ships bobbed like toys in the distance. "You're not what I expected," she said without turning around. "What did you expect? Another master. Another man who sees me as property to be used and discarded." She turned to face him, and in the afternoon light streaming through the window, Isaiah could see something that made his breath catch. Her shadow was wrong. While Adira stood perfectly still, her shadow seemed to writhe and twist on the wall behind her, as if it had a life of its own. And for just a moment, Isaiah could have sworn he saw additional shapes moving within it, tall, angular forms that definitely weren't human. "You see it, don't you?" Adira asked softly. "You see what follows me?" Isaiah's mouth went dry. What are they?" "The price of my mother's desperation," she said, her voice heavy with old pain. "The cost of a bargain made in blood and terror." Before Isaiah could ask what she meant, a commotion erupted from downstairs. Mrs. Pemberton was screaming. They rushed down to find the landlady standing in her kitchen, pointing at the stove with a shaking finger. The cast iron surface was glowing red hot, though no fire burned beneath it. The air shimmered with heat, and the smell of sulfur filled the room. "It started the moment she walked in," Mrs. Pemberton sobbed. "The moment that thing crossed my threshold." Adira approached the stove calmly and placed her hand directly on the glowing surface. Isaiah lunged forward to stop her, but she held up her other hand. "Don't," she said simply. Her palm rested on the red-hot iron for a full 10 seconds. When she lifted it, her skin was unmarked, unblemished. The stove immediately began to cool, the supernatural heat dissipating like morning mist. Mrs. Pemberton fainted dead away. "This is what happens," Adira said, turning to Isaiah with eyes that held centuries of sorrow. "This is why no one will buy me, why no one can keep me. The darkness that follows me touches everything I touch, everyone I'm near." Isaiah stared at her, his mind reeling. "But why? What did your mother do?" Adira's expression grew distant, haunted. "She made a deal to save me. When I was just a baby dying of fever, she called on powers that should never be summoned. She offered her soul, her bloodline, her very essence to keep me alive. And they accepted? Oh, they accepted. But they wanted more than just her soul. They wanted a vessel, someone to carry their influence into the world of the living." Adira's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They wanted me." Isaiah felt the room grow cold around them. Mrs. Pemberton's unconscious form lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, but neither of them moved to help her. "So you're—" Isaiah couldn't bring himself to say it. "Possessed? Cursed? Damned?" Adira shrugged. "All of the above, I suppose. The entities that answered my mother's call bound themselves to me. They feed on the life force of those around me, growing stronger with each death, each tragedy they cause. But you saved Mrs. Pemberton just now. You stopped whatever was happening to the stove. For the first time since he'd met her, Adira smiled. A real smile, not the bitter twist of lips he'd seen before. That's the thing they didn't count on, she said. My mother's love was stronger than their hunger. Part of her protection still lives in me. I can fight them sometimes. Control them for short periods. But not always. No, not always. And they're getting stronger, Mr. Morton. Hungrier. Soon I won't be able to hold them back at all. Isaiah looked down at Mrs. Pemberton's pale face, then back at Adira. What happens then? Adira's smile faded. Then everyone dies. Everyone I've ever met. Everyone I've ever cared about. The entities will use me to open a doorway between their realm and ours, and this world will become their feeding ground. Outside, thunder rumbled across the Charleston sky, though there wasn't a cloud to be seen. The darkness was coming, and Isaiah was beginning to understand that he might be the only one who could stop it, if he lived long enough. That night, Isaiah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old boarding house, every whisper of wind through the shutters, every distant sound from the harbor made him start. Adira sat in the room's single chair, staring out the window at the moonlit streets below, as motionless as a statue. Does she ever sleep? He wondered, then immediately questioned whether he really wanted to know the answer. Tell me about your mother, he said finally, breaking the oppressive silence. Adira didn't turn from the window. Her name was Casey. She was born in what you call the Gold Coast, stolen when she was 16 and brought here on a ship called the Mercy's Dream. Her voice carried a bitter irony. Mercy, as if there was any mercy in that floating hell. Isaiah had heard the stories, the Middle Passage, the horrific conditions, the death rates that made slave ships floating graveyards. But hearing it from someone whose mother had lived it made his stomach clench with fresh revulsion. She was sold to a rice plantation outside Charleston, the Blackwood estate. Adira's reflection in the window glass looked ghostly, translucent. The master there, Cornelius Blackwood, he took liberties with the women. My mother was no exception. So that's how she came to be, Isaiah thought, his heart aching for this woman who carried so much pain. But Casey was different from the other slaves. She remembered the old ways, the old knowledge from her homeland. She knew how to speak to the spirits, how to call on powers that most people had forgotten. Adira finally turned to face him. When I was born, I was sickly, weak. The plantation doctor said I wouldn't live to see my first birthday, so she used magic to save you. Not magic, something far older and more dangerous. Adira stood and began pacing the small room, her movements fluid and predatory. There are entities that exist in the spaces between worlds, Mr. Morton, ancient things that hunger for life, for warmth, for the spark that makes us human. They're always listening, always waiting for someone desperate enough to call on them. Isaiah felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. And your mother was that desperate. She was dying herself by then. Blackwood had worked her nearly to death, and she knew that if she passed, I would have no protection at all. So one night, she took me deep into the swamplands beyond the plantation, to a place where the veil between worlds grows thin. Adira stopped pacing and fixed Isaiah with those unsettling dark eyes. She drew symbols in the mud with her own blood. She spoke words in a language that predates human civilization, and she called them. What did they look like? You don't see them, not really. You feel them, like ice water in your veins, like the moment between lightning and thunder stretched into eternity. They spoke to her without words, communicated through pure terror and hunger. Isaiah's hands were shaking now. What did they want in exchange for your life? Everything, Adira said simply. Her soul, her bloodline, her descendants for 7 generations. But most importantly, they wanted me, a vessel they could use to anchor themselves in this world. And she agreed? She was a mother, watching her child die. Of course she agreed. Adira's voice broke slightly. But she was cleverer than they expected. In the moment of the binding, she wove her own protection into the spell. Her love, her sacrifice, her determination to save me. It became a barrier they couldn't fully cross. That's why you can fight them sometimes. Yes, but the protection is weakening with each passing year, and they're growing stronger, more impatient. They've been feeding on the deaths around me, storing power for the moment when they can finally break through. A sudden crash from downstairs made them both freeze. It was followed by Mrs. Pemberton's terrified screaming. They rushed down to find the landlady backed into a corner of the parlor, pointing at the fireplace with a trembling finger. The cold ashes had spontaneously burst into flames, but these weren't normal flames. They burned black and purple, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. And in those shadows, Isaiah could see shapes. Tall, angular forms with too many joints and eyes like burning coals. "They're getting stronger," Adira whispered. "My presence here is feeding them, giving them more power to manifest." Mrs. Pemberton's screams had awakened the other boarders. Isaiah could hear footsteps and voices from upstairs, people demanding to know what was happening. "We have to leave," he said urgently. Now before, the black flames suddenly roared higher, and one of the shadow entities stepped partially into the physical world. It was roughly humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. Limbs that bent in impossible directions. A face that was all angles and hunger, fingers that ended in claws like broken glass. Mrs. Pemberton's screams cut off abruptly as the thing turned its burning gaze on her. She collapsed, her body convulsing as if she were having a seizure. "No!" Adira stepped forward, placing herself between the entity and the fallen woman. "You will not have her!" The shadow creature hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a kettle, but filled with malevolent intelligence. It spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The vessel resists, but resistance grows weaker. Soon all barriers fall. Soon we feast." Adira raised her hands, and Isaiah could see light beginning to emanate from her skin. Not the warm golden light of a candle, but something cooler, more ethereal. The light of a mother's love made manifest. "You bound yourself to me," she said, her voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "But I am not yours to command. Not yet." The entity recoiled as if struck, its form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. The black flames in the fireplace guttered and died, leaving only the smell of sulfur and something else. Something that reminded Isaiah of graveyards and forgotten places. Mrs. Pemberton stopped convulsing and lay still, breathing but unconscious. "Is she?" Isaiah began. "She'll live," Adira said, but her voice was strained with exhaustion. "But I can't protect everyone, Mr. Morton. The entities are testing their strength, probing for weaknesses. Each manifestation makes them bolder." The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder. Soon, the other boarders would come down to investigate. "We need to go," Isaiah said. "If they see what just happened, they'll call for the authorities. Or worse, they'll try to kill me themselves." Adira nodded grimly. "There's somewhere we need to go, somewhere I've been avoiding because I knew that once I went there, there would be no turning back." "Where?" "The Blackwood plantation, where it all began." Adira moved toward the door, then paused. "My mother left something there. Something that might be able to break the binding permanently, or it will give the entities exactly what they need to complete their manifestation in this world." Adira's smile was sharp as a blade. "Either way, this ends soon." As they slipped out into the Charleston night, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by human eyes, but by something far older and infinitely more patient. Behind them, Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house stood silent and dark, but Isaiah could have sworn he saw shadows moving in the windows, shadows that had no earthly source. The hunt was beginning, and they were both predator and prey. The journey to the Blackwood plantation took them through the dark heart of the South Carolina Lowcountry, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like the tattered remnants of funeral shrouds. Isaiah had borrowed a horse and cart from a sympathetic contact in the abolitionist underground, though he'd been careful not to mention Adira's unique circumstances. How do you explain that you're traveling with a woman who might be the key to preventing an otherworldly invasion? He thought grimly. The plantation lay 20 miles northwest of Charleston, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to grow narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. As they traveled deeper into the countryside, Isaiah noticed that the very landscape seemed to react to Adira's presence. Birds fell silent as their cart approached, then burst into frenzied song once they'd passed. Cattle in distant fields huddled together, lowing nervously. Even the trees seemed to lean away from the road, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. "It's been like this since I was a child," Adira said, noticing his observations. "The natural world can sense what I carry. Animals are more honest than humans. They don't pretend not to see the darkness. Have you ever been back here, to the plantation?" "Once, when I was 12. Her voice grew distant. "I wanted to see where my mother had lived, where she'd made her terrible bargain. But the moment I set foot on Blackwood land, what happened? Every slave on the plantation started screaming at the same time, not in fear, in agony, as if something was trying to claw its way out of their souls." Adira's hands clenched in her lap. "I ran. I've been running ever since." The sun was setting as they finally reached the plantation gates, massive iron barriers that hung askew on rusted hinges. The Blackwood estate had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, ever since Cornelius Blackwood had died under mysterious circumstances. Local rumors claimed he'd been found in his study, aged decades overnight, his hair white as snow, and his eyes gone, just empty sockets staring at nothing. Another victim of whatever follows Adira, Isaiah realized with a chill. The main house loomed before them like a monument to decay. Once grand columns were cracked and stained with mold. Windows stared blindly from facades covered in creeping vines. The entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of its own dark history. "The slave quarters are behind the house," Adira said as they approached. "That's where my mother lived, where she kept her tools." They left the cart near the main house and walked through what had once been manicured gardens. Now, the paths were choked with weeds and thorny vines that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. The slave quarters were a row of small wooden buildings, most of them partially collapsed, but one structure at the end of the row remained intact, as if something had been preserving it against the ravages of time and weather. "That one," Adira said, pointing. "That's where we lived." As they approached the building, Isaiah felt the hair on his arms stand on end. The air around the structure seemed to shimmer with an energy that made his teeth ache. And there was a sound barely audible, like whispers carried on a wind that touched nothing else. The door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the single room was surprisingly well preserved. A rough wooden table, a straw mattress in one corner, a few clay pots and iron tools. But what drew Isaiah's attention was the floor. Carved directly into the wooden planks was an intricate pattern of symbols and lines. The design was so complex it hurt to look at directly, as if his mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "My mother's work," Adira said softly. "She spent years carving this, adding to it, perfecting it. It's a map." "A map of what?" "The spaces between worlds, the pathways the entities use to travel from their realm to ours." Adira knelt beside the carved pattern, her fingers tracing the lines with reverent care. "And here, at the center, is the anchor point. The place where she bound them to me." Isaiah studied the design more closely and felt his sanity strain at the edges. The symbols seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested geometries that shouldn't exist. "There's something else," Adira said. She moved to the far corner of the room and began pulling up loose floorboards. Beneath them, was a small cavity containing a wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of items that made Isaiah's blood run cold. Bones carved with more of the impossible symbols, a knife with a blade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a small clay vessel sealed with wax and bound with what looked like human hair. "My mother's emergency plan," Adira explained. "If the binding ever became too strong, if the entities ever grew too powerful, she left me a way to break it permanently." "What's in the vessel?" "Her blood, her tears, her final words of love and protection." Adira's voice was barely above a whisper. "And something else, a piece of her soul that she managed to hide from the entities during the original binding." Isaiah felt hope flicker in his chest. "So, you can break free? You can end this?" "Yes, but..." Adira's expression grew grim. "The ritual requires a willing sacrifice. Someone has to take my place as the anchor point. Someone has to bind the entities to themselves instead of me." The hope died as quickly as it had been born. "And then what happens to that person? They become what I am, cursed, hunted, slowly consumed from within until there's nothing left but a shell for the entities to inhabit." Isaiah stared at the carved symbols on the floor, his mind racing. There has to be another way, some other solution. "There is one other option," Adira said quietly. "We could complete the original ritual, open the doorway fully, and let the entities through." "That's insane. You said yourself that would mean the end of everything." "Not everything, just this world, this reality." Adira's smile was sharp and bitter. "The entities would feed until there was nothing left, then move on to other realms, other realities. Eventually they would grow dormant again, and life could begin anew." "How long would that take?" "A few thousand years, maybe more." Isaiah felt sick. "Those are our only choices? Sacrifice someone else? Or let these things destroy the world?" Before Adira could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the walls, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The carved symbols on the floor began to glow with a sickly green light. "The vessel returns to the place of binding," a voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. "How fitting, how convenient." The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and coalesce, taking on the familiar angular shapes of the entities. But these were stronger than the one they'd encountered at the boarding house, more solid, more real. "We have fed well on the fear and death that follows you, vessel. We are strong enough now to manifest without your permission, strong enough to take what was promised to us." Adira clutched the clay vessel to her chest. "You cannot have me. The binding is not complete." "The binding was completed the moment you set foot on this cursed ground. Your mother's protections are meaningless here. This is our place now, our anchor in your world." The entities began to advance, their forms becoming more solid with each step. Isaiah could see details now that made his sanity real, faces that were collections of eyes and teeth, limbs that bent in directions that violated every law of physics, claws that seemed to cut through reality itself. "Adira," he said urgently, "whatever you're going to do it now." She looked at him with eyes full of ancient sorrow. "I'm sorry, Isaiah. I'm so sorry for what I'm about to ask of you." And in that moment, he understood. The choice wasn't between sacrificing someone else or letting the world end. The choice was whether he was brave enough to make the sacrifice himself. "No," Isaiah said firmly, stepping between Adira and the advancing entities. "There has to be another way." The shadow creatures paused, their burning eyes fixed on him with what might have been amusement. "The mortal thinks to bargain with forces beyond his comprehension," they hissed in unison. "How quaint." "I'm not bargaining," Isaiah replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "I'm offering myself in her place." Adira's gasp cut through the supernatural cold. "Isaiah, no, you don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly." He turned to face her, and she could see the resolve burning in his eyes. "You didn't choose this curse. You were an innocent child when it was placed on you, but I'm choosing this freely." "Interesting," the entities whispered. "A willing sacrifice. Such offerings carry additional power." "Don't listen to them," Adira pleaded. "They're lying. The binding will destroy you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of who you are." "Maybe. But at least I'll have chosen my own fate." Isaiah reached for the clay vessel in her hands, "and maybe my choice will be enough to break their hold on you permanently." The entities were circling them now, their forms becoming more solid and defined. Isaiah could smell them, a mixture of grave dirt and burning sulfur that made his eyes water. "The vessel resists the transfer," they observed. "She has grown attached to this mortal." How deliciously ironic. "Shut up," Adira snarled, and for a moment her voice carried the same otherworldly resonance it had at the boarding house. "You know nothing of attachment, nothing of love. We know hunger, we know need, we know the sweet taste of despair when hope dies." The entity's laughter was like breaking glass. "And we know that you will watch this mortal suffer as we have made you suffer." Isaiah felt something cold and sharp brush against his mind, a probing touch that made him want to scream. The entities were testing him, tasting his resolve. "Get out of my head," he growled. "Such strength, such determination. Yes, you will make an excellent vessel. Your suffering will sustain us for decades." "Isaiah, please," Adira whispered. "There has to be another way. My mother was clever. She must have left some other option." Isaiah looked down at the carved symbols on the floor, and suddenly an idea began to form. "What if we don't transfer the binding? What if we destroy it entirely?" "That's impossible. The entities exist outside our reality. They can't be destroyed by anything in this world." "But the anchor point can be," Isaiah pointed to the center of the carved pattern, where the lines converged in a complex knot of symbols. "Your mother bound them to you through this place, through these markings. What if we destroyed the anchor itself?" Adira's eyes widened. The backlash would be enormous. It could tear a hole between the worlds, or it could sever their connection permanently. Isaiah was already moving toward the center of the pattern. "Either way, it ends here." "Foolish mortal," the entities hissed. "You understand nothing of the forces you seek to unleash." "Maybe not, but I understand enough." Isaiah knelt at the center of the carved design and placed his hands on the convergence point. "I understand that some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight kills you." The moment his skin touched the symbols, pain exploded through his body. It felt like every nerve was being flayed with razors, like his blood was turning to acid in his veins. But through the agony, he could feel something else, a connection to the vast, hungry darkness that had been feeding on Adira for her entire life. "Stop!" the entities shrieked. "You will destroy us all!" "That's the idea," Isaiah gasped through gritted teeth. Adira was beside him now, her hands covering his on the carved symbols. "If you're going to do this, you're not doing it alone." The moment she touched the anchor point, the entire room exploded with light and shadow. The carved symbols began to burn with an intensity that hurt to look at. The walls shook and cracks appeared in the wooden floor. "The binding breaks," the entities wailed. "The anchor fails. We are cast back into the void." But even as they spoke, Isaiah could feel them fighting the dissolution, clinging to their foothold in reality with desperate hunger. They were ancient and powerful, and they would not be banished easily. "It's not working!" he shouted over the supernatural storm raging around them. "They're too strong." "Then we need more power," Adira replied. She reached for the clay vessel with her free hand and smashed it against the floor. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The room filled with a presence that was warm and loving and fierce, the spirit of Kessie, Adira's mother, preserved in blood and tears and desperate hope. "My daughter," a voice whispered, seeming to come from the very air around them. "My beautiful, brave daughter, I have waited so long to help you." The entities recoiled, as if struck. Impossible. The mother's soul was consumed in the original binding. "You took most of me, yes, but a mother's love cannot be fully consumed. It endures, it protects, it fights." Kessie's spirit flowed into the anchor point, adding her power to Isaiah's and Adira's. The carved symbols began to crack and splinter, their otherworldly geometry breaking down under the assault. "We will not be denied," the entities shrieked. "We will drag you all into the void with us." They lunged forward, their claws reaching for Isaiah and Adira. But Kessie's spirit formed a barrier around them, a wall of maternal love that the creatures could not penetrate. "You bound yourselves to my daughter through trickery and desperation," Kessie's voice rang out like a bell. "But love is stronger than hunger, hope is stronger than despair, and sacrifice freely given is stronger than any curse." The anchor point cracked with a sound like thunder. The entities' forms began to waver and fade, their connection to this reality severing like a cut rope. "This is not over!" they screamed as they were pulled back into the void. "We will find another way, another vessel, another—" Their voices cut off abruptly as the anchor point shattered completely. The carved symbols crumbled to dust, and the supernatural storm died as suddenly as it had begun. Isaiah and Adira collapsed to the floor, exhausted and shaking. Around them, the slave quarters looked like they'd been hit by a hurricane. Walls cracked, furniture overturned, the very air still crackling with residual energy. "Is it over?" Isaiah asked weakly. Adira closed her eyes and reached out with senses she'd carried her entire life. For the first time in 21 years, she felt nothing. No hungry presence lurking at the edges of her consciousness. No cold whispers promising death and despair. "It's over," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're gone. The binding is broken. My daughter is free." Casey's voice came one last time, already fading. "My sacrifice was not in vain. Live, my beautiful girl. Live and be happy." And then she was gone too, her spirit finally at peace. Isaiah and Adira sat in the ruins of the slave quarters as the sun set outside, holding each other and marveling at the simple miracle of being alive and unbound. But neither of them noticed the small crack that had appeared in the far wall, a crack that seemed to lead not to the outside world, but to somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dark and hungry and patient. The entities had been banished, yes, but they had left something behind. A seed, a possibility, and in the shadows of that crack, something new was already beginning to grow. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the Blackwood plantation, and Charleston was slowly returning to what passed for normal in the antebellum South. The mysterious deaths and supernatural incidents that had plagued the city during Adira's presence had ceased entirely, leaving behind only whispered rumors and nervous glances. Isaiah had returned to his work, documenting the horrors of slavery, but with a new urgency born from his recent experiences. He'd seen firsthand how desperation could drive people to make bargains with forces beyond their comprehension, and he was more determined than ever to end the system that created such desperation. Adira had taken a position as a seamstress with a family of free blacks in the city. The Washingtons, who had asked no questions about her past and seemed genuinely grateful for her skill with needle and thread. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing something approaching normalcy. "Is this what peace feels like?" she wondered as she worked on a dress for Mrs. Washington's daughter. The absence of the constant whispers, the freedom from the shadow entity's hunger, it was almost overwhelming in its simplicity. But peace, as they were about to discover, was a fragile thing. Isaiah was walking through the market district when he first noticed the changes. Subtle things that most people would dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Shadows that fell at wrong angles. Dogs that whined and cowered for no apparent reason. A persistent smell of sulfur that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "It's just my imagination," he told himself. "After what we went through, it's natural to be paranoid." But when he arrived at the Washington house that evening to visit Adira, he found her standing at the window with a troubled expression. "You feel it too, don't you?" she said without turning around. "Feel what?" But even as he asked, Isaiah knew what she meant. There was something in the air, a tension that made his skin crawl. "They're not gone," Adira said quietly. "Not completely. Something's still here. That's impossible. We destroyed the anchor point. We broke the binding. We broke my binding." But Adira turned to face him, and he could see fear in her eyes, a fear he'd hoped never to see again. What if they left something behind? What if they planted a seed before they were banished? Before Isaiah could respond, a commotion erupted from the street outside. Shouting voices, running footsteps, the sound of breaking glass. They rushed to the window to see what was happening. A crowd had gathered around the slave auction block in the market square. But this wasn't a normal auction. The platform was empty, except for a single figure standing motionless in the center. It was a young boy, maybe 10 years old, with dark skin and eyes that stared at nothing. He stood perfectly still as chaos erupted around him, seemingly oblivious to the panic his presence was causing. "Dear God," Adira whispered, "it's starting again." They rushed outside and pushed through the crowd toward the auction block. As they got closer, Isaiah could see what was causing the panic. The boy's shadow was wrong, just like Adira's had been. It writhed and twisted independently of his body, and within its darkness, shapes moved with hungry intelligence. "How long has he been standing there?" Isaiah asked a nearby merchant. "About an hour," the man replied, his voice shaking. "Just appeared out of nowhere and hasn't moved since, and the temperature..." He shivered despite the warm evening air. "It's like winter around that platform." Adira approached the auction block slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The boy's eyes tracked to her as she drew near, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same otherworldly resonance that hers once had. "Sister," he said simply. "What's your name?" Adira asked gently. "Tobias, but they call me something else now. They call me Vessel." Isaiah felt ice water in his veins. "The entities, they found another host." "Not found," Tobias corrected, his young voice carrying ancient malevolence. "Created. The seed they planted in the crack between worlds has grown. Fed on the fear and desperation that permeates this place, and now it seeks a new anchor." "But you're just a child," Adira said, her voice breaking. "I was a child. Now I am becoming something else." Tobias tilted his head, studying her with eyes that held far too much knowledge. "They learned from their mistakes with you. This time they chose someone with no mother to protect him, no love to shield him, no hope to sustain him." The crowd around the auction block was growing larger and more agitated. Isaiah could hear people calling for the authorities, for someone to do something about the demon child who had appeared in their midst. "We have to get him away from here," Isaiah said urgently. "If the authorities get involved..." "It won't matter," Tobias interrupted. "The binding is already complete. The entities have learned patience. They will not make the same mistakes they made with the previous vessel. There has to be a way to help you," Adira insisted. "We broke my binding. We can break yours too." Tobias smiled, an expression that looked wrong on such a young face. "The previous vessel had advantages I do not possess. A mother's love, a protector's sacrifice, hope." His smile faded. "I have none of these things. I am alone with the hunger." As if summoned by his words, the shadow entities began to manifest more clearly. The crowd's panic reached a crescendo as people saw the angular, impossible shapes moving within the boy's shadow. "Run!" Tobias said, his voice suddenly urgent, as if the real child was fighting through the possession for just a moment. "They're coming, all of them. The crack is widening and they're pouring through." The temperature around the auction block plummeted. Frost began forming on the wooden platform, and the very air seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. "The new vessel serves us well," The familiar voices whispered from the shadows, but we remember the ones who banished us. We remember, and we hunger for revenge. The entities began to take more solid form, their claws and teeth gleaming in the lamplight.